Hilary Beckles, Vice-Chancellor of the University of the West Indies and host of this media engagement today, Honorable Mia Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados and Chair of the CARICOM Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparation, Honorable Olivia Grange, Jamaica's Minister of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sport, Minister with portfolio responsibility for the island's National Council on Reparation, members of the media fraternity, members of the CARICOM Reparation Commission, and affiliated national councils and committees on reparation, reparation advocates everywhere, those joining us on Facebook and on UWI's TV's webpage, those in this physically distanced audience here at the University of the West Indies, friends all, good morning. My name is Vereen Shepherd, Director of the Center for Reparation Research here at the University of the West Indies, and I'll be your moderator today, and it is my pleasure to serve in that role in this media engagement this morning. Now, the purpose of this media engagement, organized by the CARICOM Reparation Commission in collaboration with UWI-TV, is to update the media on recent developments in the CARICOM region's push for reparatory justice for the historical crimes of native genocide and African enslavement in the Caribbean region. By way of background, the CRC was established at the 34th regular meeting of the Conference of Heads of Government in July 2013 in Trinidad and Tobago, following a proposal from the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Dr. the Honorable Ralph Gonsalves, to engage the United Kingdom and other former colonial European nations on the matter. The proposal was made against the backdrop of a book written by Professor Sir Hilary Beckles entitled Britain's Black Debt, Reparations for Caribbean Slavery and the Native Genocide. The CRC was tasked with providing advice, coordinating the overall strategy, and implementing national and regional activities to pursue reparations. The overall objective of the Commission is to establish the moral, ethical, and legal case for the payment of reparations by the governments of all the former colonial powers and the relevant institutions of those countries to the nations and people of the Caribbean community for the crimes against humanity of native genocide. Now, this media engagement is taking place against the background, in the wake of recent public statements of apology and regret by some European states and a number of British commercial enterprises for their role in the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans and in the 200-plus years practice of chattel enslavement. Now, to say something more about that, we know that 8 founders and subscribers to Lloyd's of London, according to recent revelations, were linked to slavery, including John Julius Angerstein, the chairman, Joseph Marriott, another chairman, and Henry Wildman, who owned Esher Estate in St. Mary. And 5 governors and directors and 3 directors of the Bank of England claimed compensation for enslaved Africans, including Director Thomas Baring, who claimed on 1,015 enslaved Africans. It also comes in the wake of global activism around issues of justice, human rights, and repair of fractured international relations as part of the Black Lives Matter movement that intensified after the murder of George Floyd. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, and various UN treaty bodies and special procedures have all issued statements condemning racial discrimination and appealing for greater social justice, with the High Commissioner addressing an urgent debate on racism and police brutality at the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva on June 17, 2020, urging countries to confront the legacy of slavery and colonialism and to make amends for centuries of violence and discrimination, including through formal apologies, truth-telling processes, and reparations in various forms. But this media engagement also comes in the midst of pushback on the reparation agenda. Recently, a diplomat from the UK said on CVM TV in Jamaica, and I quote, Well, the question was, is it time to revisit seriously the concept of actual reparations because the owners were paid? However, the enslaved people themselves and their descendants have not been paid. How is Her Majesty's government looking at that issue? That was the question. While expressing abhorrence for what happened under slavery, he said, among other things, that, and I quote, "Our way of doing this thing has always been for living people or people who have been directly impacted as a result of some sort of wrongdoing. The idea in the UK that you pay for people who long since passed is not something that we have done." So what should CARICOM's strategy now be in the midst of this global conversation, especially in light of complicit states' refusal to accept responsibility and engage in a meaningful reparation dialogue? How do we get states to move from regret to a meaningful apology, which takes responsibility, commits to repair, and commits to non-repetition? And then, from apology, the first point in the CARICOM 10-point action plan, to the other points in the plan, a plan which outlines the path to reconciliation, truth, justice for victims of slavery and native genocide and their descendants, and highlights the 10 areas or actions to be pursued in negotiations with European states, and which would be in the focus of reparatory action in member states. So this morning, our panelists will engage with this conversation. We have 3 panelists, and they will give their own perspectives on these testy issues. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles. Sir Hilary Beckles is Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. He continues to have a distinguished career as an academic, international thought leader, with many reviewed essays in scholarly journals and at least 12 published books and others in the works. Sir Hilary is also a United Nations Committee official and global public activist in the field of social justice and minority empowerment. In 2013, as we all know, he was invited to coordinate Caribbean government's policy positions on the global reparatory justice conversation. And so, in that capacity, he is the chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. So, Sir Hilary, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and very good day to everyone. It's a pleasure once again to share this conversation with Prime Minister Motley and Minister Grange. The protocol is observed, and in that regard, I wish to celebrate all of our colleagues in the regional and global reparations movement. This is indeed an historical moment. It's a juncture in the evolution of the search for justice, and to put behind us the consequences of the crimes against humanity that were committed in the forms of the genocide of the native peoples, the chattel enslavement of enchained African peoples, and the deceptive indentureship that was imposed upon the people of India and Asia, who were brought in to the Caribbean to establish phase 2 of a slavery paradigm. It took us all of the 19th century, the full stretch of the 19th century, to uproot chattel slavery from the world. Beginning first with the people of Haiti in 1804, and ending with the people of Brazil in the middle of the 1880s. That's a solid 80 years of effort. It was a collective effort led by the enslaved people themselves, who rose up against the barbarity of slavery, the abolitionists who used civil society, moral and political platforms to demand the legal abolition of the enslaved. It was a collective effort of several generations. Then it took us all of the 20th century, to confront the legacies of harm, persistent suffering of the descendants of the enslaved, to translate their enslavement into civil rights and human rights, and to create from the legacy of slavery and colonization societies dedicated to democracy. In the context of the Caribbean today, we are among the greatest advocates of the democratic culture. And we have crafted from the legacy of colonization a globally respected culture of democracy based on civil and human rights. This is now the age of reparations. This is the age when the crimes and their legacies and their continuing harm are being recognized. This is a moment where the pain and suffering of communities that have descended from the enslaved and the indentured are calling for justice, and fairness and dignity within the context of the continuing harm that is a part of our societies. The colonial mess that we have inherited from Britain and from Europe remains visible in every aspect of the Caribbean world. Britain and Europe chose to walk away from this mess that they have created and have left it entirely to the leadership, the democratic leadership of Caribbean governments and civil society. This was a deliberate strategic effort to walk away and refuse to take responsibility for the legacies of slavery and colonization. The model which was used by Britain at the moment of the ending of colonization was that Britain should exit colonization and its legacies on the cheap, that they should exit without responsibility, that they should walk away and not look back. The theory emerging from the British government and many other governments in Europe is that those who are continuing to suffer and experience the harm, the governments that are cleaning up the mess they've inherited from colonization and slavery, is that they should move on and that the citizens should get over it. The Caribbean governments have done well in confronting this legacy of harm, this legacy in which citizens continue to feel the damaging consequences of their very present experience. The governments have done well to confront and take responsibility for cleaning up this mess. But the fact of the matter is that the inherited legacy has overwhelmed the best and greatest intentions of our civil societies and our governments. The systemic poverty that has been inherited from colonization and slavery. And we must remember that when Britain departed the Caribbean in most of the countries where they had colonized, they left behind 60% of all the black people in the Caribbean were functionally illiterate. And this is after 300 years of extracting wealth from the Caribbean to build British industrial development, the extraction of wealth from slavery and colonization to promote British transformation from an agricultural into an industrial nation, and to sustain that culture, they walked away and told the emerging citizens to build a nation. You're on your own, stand on your own two legs and build your own nation. Britain left behind a pandemic of chronic diseases. The hypertension, the diabetic pandemic collectively has constituted a threat to the existence of Caribbean societies. Over 60% of all of the people in the Caribbean today, over the age of 60, have either hypertension, diabetes, or both. The Caribbean is the diabetic hypertensive center of the world. Barbados and Jamaica constitute the amputation capital of the world as a result of complications arising from diabetes. More amputations are committed in the Caribbean per capita than any other part of the world. This is because for 300 years, the people of this region were forced to consume a diet based on what they produce, sugar. In this part of the world, sugar was consumed not as a sweetener. Sugar was consumed as a meal, as part of the dietary plan. We now have this enormous pandemic sweeping through this region. Billions of dollars are spent in this region each year dealing with the consequences and the legacies of an enforced diet of sugar and salt to which the people of the region are now addicted. If we take the marker of chronic diseases, the black people in the Caribbean are the sickest people in the world on a per capita basis. This is a direct consequence and legacy of slavery and colonization. The slum clearance. In 1926, former Prime Minister Lloyd George described the Caribbean as the slum of the British Empire. The slum of the British Empire that was an embarrassment to the British Empire. The governments of the Caribbean started out their independence journey on a struggle to clean up these slums of the region, which they have inherited. Britain walked away. Britain and the European powers insisted that the Caribbean should not be the site of industrialization, of technological applications to production, that they are to produce raw materials and raw materials only. This has continued to distort the structures and the pedagogy around development in this region. The region is still suffering the harm of British policy. Prime Minister Pitt, in the middle of the 18th century, noted that in the Caribbean colonies, not even a nail is to be manufactured. That was British policy right into the 20th century. Not even a nail is to be manufactured. The poor academic infrastructure, the notion that West Indian people were meant to be unskilled laborers, agricultural laborers. We were not meant to carry forward a culture of academic development, higher education. It was the late, great Marcus Garvey who in 1926 called for a university in this region. It was rejected. The psychological terror associated with the politics of development, the continuing harm to this region caused by unfair and unreasonable assertions about the financial sector of this region. Governments seeking to participate in the financial system of the world continue to experience the harassment of those nations that do not believe the Caribbean should transition into international finance. These and many, many other issues are the legacies that this region continues to experience. In 1938, Sir Arthur Lewis, developing a strategy to industrialize the Caribbean and to modernize the Caribbean, asked the question, where is the Caribbean to find the resources to fund their transition out of colonialism, to fund their transition into modernity? Where are these colonies to find the resources to make the transition? This was 100 years after slavery, and the region was still colonized. Arthur Lewis argued that first we should begin with Britain's black debt. He said that Britain has had the benefit of 200 years of free labor from over 15 million black people in the Caribbean and those who were indentured from India. That in the case of the black community, they had 200 years of free labor from over 15 million people that gave them the profits to modernize their economies. That this is a debt, he argued. This is a debt, Sir Arthur Lewis argued, Nobel laureate, that Britain still owes this region, a debt that must be repaid. The British government has consistently rejected this debt. They have consistently refused to recognize and to honor the consequences of this debt. We have argued in the Caribbean that reparatory justice is about development, that Britain and Europe do indeed owe a debt to this region, a debt that is recognized, a debt that can be computed, a debt that is historically sound in terms of its legitimacy. Because the region was still within the colonial stage of its history, it was not in a position to reject what Britain and Europe had said, that there is no debt, that there is no responsibility, that we will not accept responsibility for the impoverishment of the Caribbean. We are now independent nations to a large extent, and this debt is a debt that must be recognized and accepted and honored. And we have said in the Caribbean Reparations Commission that this is a debt to development. And as a consequence, the Caribbean Reparations Commission is calling for a reparations summit in much the same way that the region met with the European governments to discuss independence. This is phase 2 of the independence process. The meeting and the summit over 3 days to discuss how to honor this debt owed to the Caribbean at this moment in history. And we're proposing a 3-day summit in which day 1 will be a conversation between the governments. Day 2, in which there will be a conversation with the private sector. We have heard of late of major private sector institutions that emerge out of slavery, that emerge out of colonization, that were enriched by the crimes against humanity, have issued comments of regret. The major institutions in the City of London, for example, have all made their statements. Time has come now to move to that summit with these major corporations to discuss their contribution to a development plan for the Caribbean. Day 3 will be civil society, where civil society institutions and individuals, most of the universities of Europe, participated in the enrichment from slavery. Some universities are now ready to discuss this legacy and to allocate resources for research, for collective action. The Church of England, that owned hundreds of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean. The Church of England will brand their slaves on their chests with the letters C of E, Church of England. It is also their turn to join in the civil society conversation about reparations for development. This is how we imagine this conference can be organized: an intergovernmental civil society summit, so that we could move into phase 2 of our exit from colonialism. Apologies are not enough. Apologies are precursors for reparations. Apologies are signals of an intent to participate in a reparatory process. Apologies are stage 1 of an effort that says we acknowledge the harm we have caused and we are prepared to enter phase 2, which is a discussion and a negotiation about how to repair that harm and that suffering that continues to be the legacy in the Caribbean today. This is where we are. This is a moment for responsible leadership. This is not the time to continue to brush this matter under a carpet. There is no carpet in the world that is large enough to conceal and contain this legacy that must now be confronted and removed. This is a time for moral leadership. This is a time of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is really an enormous broom that is seeking to sweep up the debris of a difficult and painful past. And there's no escaping it. This is the moment of reparatory justice. This is the time to repair the harm and end the suffering resulting from the crimes that were committed against the enslaved and indentured peoples in the Caribbean and the long legacy of colonialism. And we must remember, colonialism today remains a feature of the Caribbean. There are still many societies that are classified as colonies in the Caribbean. And this is where we are, ladies and gentlemen. We are asking for an orderly transition into this second phase of our independence, which is to bring closure to the issue of the legacy that continues to create harm to citizens today as we speak. We are looking to the future. We are looking to a future of development. And we insist and maintain that Britain and Europe should honor their debt to this region, resulting from centuries of wealth extraction from this region. The late great Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Eric Williams, in an address to students at the London School of Economics in 1962, on the eve of his country's independence, made the statement that for us in the Caribbean, Britain sees us as an orange. They have sucked the orange dry. They have dashed the peel upon the ground. And their fear is that they do not wish to step and slip upon it. That was his conception in 1962. We are calling for a cleaning up of this circumstance and this situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor. Thank you very much. It is now my pleasure to invite Prime Minister Motley, Honorable Prime Minister Mia Motley from Barbados, to make her presentation. But just let me tell you something about her. The Honorable Mia Motley is the 8th Prime Minister of Barbados. She became the first woman to occupy this high office following general elections on May 24, 2018, in which she led the Barbados Labour Party to an emphatic victory winning all 30 seats in the House of Assembly by the largest margin ever seen in the electoral history of Barbados. An attorney at law and Queen's Counsel, Prime Minister Motley has been active in the political life of Barbados for 3 decades. First elected in 1994, she's at present in her 6th term as Member of Parliament for the constituency of St. Michael North East. From 1994 to 2008, Ms. Motley served in the cabinet of 3 successive administrations, first as Minister of Education and Culture, then Attorney General and Minister of Home Affairs, and then Minister of Economic Affairs. In 2003, she was appointed Deputy Prime Minister, and Prime Minister Motley currently also holds the portfolios of Minister of Finance, Economic Affairs, and Sustainable Development, along with National Security and the Public Service. Importantly for this movement, she's the chair of the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparation. Prime Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And Madam Chair, I want to thank you for your continued work. And I also would like to thank Sir Hilary for his leadership on this issue on behalf of the region. The bottom line is that nothing happens by accident. Sir Hilary ended with a quotation from the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago that caused me to reflect on a similar body of work, not a quotation this time, by another Trinidadian, namely the great Earl Lovelace, who is one of this region's most distinguished post-independence writers. And he spent more than a decade crafting very finely a book called Salt that I would wish to recommend to all Caribbean people who have not read it, on the basis of understanding why the call for reparations is as strong and as critical as it has been and must be for us. I said nothing happens by accident because 20 years ago, I found myself in Santiago, Chile, running from a plane to be able to go into a hall. I'd never seen so many people of color in the Latin American continent until that day. And that was the Preparatory Committee for the World Conference Against Racism that was to take place in Durban the following year in 2001, in September. On the day before I was to travel, I was appointed Attorney General, and it was at that juncture that I asked Sir Hilary Beckles to take responsibility on behalf of the government of Barbados for our delegation, having been to both Chile and to Geneva, and over the course of the year before, trying to make the case for reparations. The world then was as inhospitable as it could possibly be on the initial requests for conversations on reparations. For those who agreed to have talks with us, both in Chile and indeed in Geneva, we were able to find that the righteousness of the argument and the solidity of the case which we were making was immediately accessible to those who could appreciate logic, who had a heart, and who recognized that what we were asking for was not in any way unfair. And that even at that point, with the limited evidence that was then available to the region, that there was a clear case. Indeed, by the end of those sessions and the preparatory work, it was clear to us that the only people across the global community who were standing in the way of apologies and reparations were in fact the Western European and American democracies, who were frightened in many instances of acknowledging and in some instances of the legal liability that they had towards indigenous people. I start from this point because for us in this region, the notion of the rightness of the reparations argument has been with us for a very, very long time. We are happy that the rest of the world is beginning to understand now that reparations is an idea whose time has come. And the truth is, we are happy that the sensitivity to this issue is being appreciated in particular by the younger generation who have, over the course of the last few months seen it come together with the public lynching of George Floyd, but recognizing that George Floyd was only but one of the last victims of what really has been horrific crimes against people of color, Black people in particular, but also before Black people, as Sir Hilary pointed out, there was the genocide against the native peoples, and there has been indentureship against white, Chinese, and Indian persons within this region and across the global community, such that the expression of power that can so nakedly deprive the humanity of another person is now finally accepted as a wrong thing and a thing to be condemned and actually to be determined fully, not just by the United Nations, but by all persons as a crime against humanity. I say this because as far back as the 16th century in Jamaica, Maroons were making a point. And the Maroon leaders demanded compensation from white enslavers. I say so because in our own case, non-governmental people and distinguished sons and daughters of the Caribbean have made the point. In the latter half of the 20th century, persons like Richard B. Moore continued to make the plan by crying out for a plan of economic rehabilitation with funds to it contributed to it by Britain, by France, by the Netherlands, and by the United States of America on the basis that significant sums of wealth had gone to people in those countries, families in those countries, and governments to be able to build out their countries. I do not need this morning to repeat the case as Sir Hilary has eloquently put it on our own behalf. But I have to ask the question now, how shall we walk the walk and not just talk the talk? The continued agitation as well as education of our peoples, not just within the Caribbean, but wherever they may be found on this earth, is absolutely critical so that they can make the difference in terms of being able to sensitize persons in their communities wherever they are found. Similarly, our ability to be able to ask formally for the discussions and to contextualize that for us reparations is not just simply about money, but it is also about justice and even in the space that allows us to have the policy flexibility to be able to deal with a lot of what we're dealing with. So Hilary made the point very eloquently with respect to what happened at the time of independence. The reality is that we were not given a development compact that allowed us to be able to move off. We were given political independence. We were given the power to make laws. And make laws we did, and make laws we did to reverse the legal trappings of discrimination and bigotry for the most part. But the trappings were not just legal. The trappings were psychological. The trappings were sociological in terms of the breaking up of our families. The trappings led to a destruction of trust, the most important virtue in the building of families, communities, and nations, and indeed a just international order, the concept of trust. And the absence of that trust flows first and foremost from an unwillingness to be sincere in the conversations that must be had. I do not know how we can go further unless there is a reckoning first and foremost that places an apology and an acknowledgement that wrong was done and that successive centuries saw the extraction of wealth and the destruction of people in a way that must never happen to any society, to any race, in any part of this world again. And for that to happen, you have first to act you're wrong. And I don't mean to be flippant, but there is no human condition that can be resolved without first acknowledging that you have it. None. And the unbelievable failure of countries to first acknowledge that with an apology, and not that something wrong happened, but with a blatant and clear apology to say, we were wrong, we will not do it again, but more importantly, we must make recompense for what was done. That is the first step of walking the walk. The second step relates to an acknowledgement that if you leave an entity 40 feet down into a hole, the only way they will get out of that hole is with assistance. And the extraction of centuries of wealth from our region, leaving the Caribbean with the very, very dire social and economic circumstances, as was expressed in the English-speaking Caribbean through the Moyne Commission, only within a generation to be propelled into independence without any form of development compact, is wrong. And the irony is that we were told at the time to diversify into tourism and diversify into financial services. Well, financial services we did, except that that has now become, within the last 20 years, one of the most clear platforms of attack which we have received from the developed world has been in the area of financial services, largely because the competitiveness of the region has caused it to be a major player globally. And to that extent, we are now being told that this is an area that we should not participate in. And to the extent that is remaining, that we should also have new forms of laws and regulations that are not necessarily reflective of the risk that we pose, but reflective of the competition that we pose to others globally. These things are wrong. And I ask us to reflect on them because one of the clear identification of actions by the Reparatory Commission of the Caribbean has been on the 10-point plan, and the issue of debt continues to be a major issue because the region is has one of the highest levels of debt any part of the world, and at the same time it has led to low growth, particularly in the last 3 or 4 decades. We are not going to get out of this by simply wishing it away. And without a clear understanding and an appreciation of the structural imbalances that come from the lack of size and of the need for policy space, and particularly at the regional, hemispheric, and international level, unless we have access to that, we are not going to be able to easily turn around the fate of our people. But I want to come also to the other issue, and that is that as we walk the walk, we must do so with sincerity. Our region, since the journey of independence has started, has tried to be able to bring more and more people on the train. But the reality is that limited capacity internationally, not having the platform of wealth from which to start to be able to invest in our people, to be able to expand the opportunities in education, to be able to treat to the issues of health, as you heard Sir Hilary speak about sugar being treated as a staple of our diet, such that we have become almost regrettably totally linked to wanting to be able to eat a certain way that is completely counter to what is necessary for us to be healthy, or our failure to be able to deal with the infrastructural needs of our society that must be a critical platform for growth. All of these things have hindered us along the way. But have they removed from us the power fully? No, they have not. And that is why across the region, successive governments since independence have tried to be able to bring development to our people as best they can. In our own instance in Barbados, the notion of the Tenantries Freehold Purchase Act was an act of land redistribution that I believe is second to none any part of the hemisphere. And to that extent, we agreed that those persons who have access to land through large plantations ought to be able to subsidize the access to the ownership of the land by the descendants of former slaves who lived on those properties without proper compensation for centuries in many instances and decades in others. Our ability to make sure that they can have access to that land at the equivalent of 5 US cents per square foot for every year over the last almost 4 decades has been a major step in shifting the condition of our people in the absence of the help that was to have come from those who should have done it at the point of independence, rather than leaving it to a post-independence government with limited resources to be able to do so. But we didn't stop there. We recognized that not everybody remained on the plantation. And at the turn of the 20th century, we had a lot of people come to town, and therefore the concept of urban tenantries became real. And we have had, over the course of our time in independence, to be able to start to transition the quality of housing in these areas But this is best done if people have land upon which to anchor any borrowing that they have to do at an individual level. Now, I give this example to show you that governments can make the difference through the power of the pen and through the power of legislation with what we put before our people to be able to carry us to the next level. The problem is that as we do it, we are not finding a hospitable policy environment to allow us to be able to move to the next level and to be able to guarantee that education should not be an issue from pre-primary to tertiary. But if a country has limited fiscal space, it will always be. And therefore, what is the development compact? What is the case for reparations that this region needs at this point in time to be able to allow us to move to the next level with respect to the compact we must have within the Caribbean community for our people with respect to education, healthcare, access to capital, and indeed land and housing. Now, I believe that some of these things are within our deliberate reach to be able to make a difference, but ultimately the scale that will lead to transformation depends on an international compact for the Caribbean. COVID-19 has come. And COVID-19 has already led, in many instances, to doubling of expenditure, in some instances in health and for social care support, a quadrupling, because all of a sudden you go from tourism sectors that are earning to tourism sectors with zero revenue and with, therefore, the lack of capacity to employ anyone. We have, therefore, my friends, to recognize that what this Caribbean region will go through over the course of this pandemic threatens to undermine the viability of our states for the medium term. Why? Because if we have to borrow money now to stabilize our condition, when the pandemic goes, you are already hearing that the region is already highly indebted, and therefore any additional borrowing that comes is going to preclude our ability to remain focused on development post-pandemic. Now, the only way we can get around this is if we are able to either ring-fence the debt incurred during the pandemic, or alternatively, be able to stretch out the debt as was done with war bonds, such that we do not go away from the fundamental precept of trying to bring development to our people in spite of the fact that we are facing other things over which we have little or no control. I have, over the course of the last few months, talked about the equivalent of a Caribbean Marshall Plan. Why? Because the economic decline that our region will face upon the tenuous foundation that it has at the point of what it inherited from the British or other European powers at the time of independence, the combination means that we do not have the stability to be able to easily move to the next level, carrying the debt and carrying the difficulties that we have to carry and fight with this pandemic. As a result, it means thinking outside of the box. And I do believe that the combination of the validity of the reparations argument, the evidence that clearly shows that there was no bank account left with us at the point of independence, there was no development compact, and far from that, there was the legitimate expectation by our people that independent governments would right the wrongs of the past and would do so quickly by giving people opportunity in this part of the world. When we begin to understand all of that, then we understand that the combination of the appropriateness of the reparations argument, as well as the reality of our economic implosion that has taken place as a result of the global pandemic, requires that we have urgent, different conversations to begin to understand that a world that is rooted in immorality, or a world that is rooted in people profiting from crimes against humanity, runs counter to the very things at the democratic level that we have asked small states and large states to be able to reflect in the context of an appropriate democracy. And what do I mean? In our democracy, if you break the law and you have assets that have come from the breaking of that law, then those assets are subject to forfeiture by the courts of law in our democracy. But at the international level, we don't want to believe that. Similarly, if at the local level, we come to the reality of families being torn apart and recognize that strong families make strong communities, make strong nations. And if that recipe is not there, then the public health disease of violence that the Caribbean is facing today, that we have one of the highest murder rates of any region, any part of the world. You've already heard Sir Hilary speak about the condition of health with respect to the high levels of chronic NCDs, and regrettably that Barbados and Jamaica and others in this region have a higher degree of amputations as a result of uncontrolled diabetes more than most. Now we need to be able to put programs in place that allow us to aggressively go on the front foot. In our own case, our government accepts that reparations is both local as well as international. And until the others internationally join us, regrettably, those of us who have the responsibility of leading Caribbean countries have to play that role in loco parentis because we are in charge and we can blame no one else. But at the same time, be exceedingly aggressive in seeking to be able to have that level playing field with respect to policy, such that Caribbean countries are not left on the wayside of development, and also that Caribbean countries can be seen and can be heard. This is a difficult battle, and this can't be won by governments alone. It requires our citizenry using the social media platforms, writing the academic articles, sharing the evidence that exists, making the movies that will shift the needle for most people, because many of our people don't read, regrettably, globally, and I don't mean about the Caribbean now, I mean across the world. And to that extent, the making of movies, the making of music, all of these things will go towards shifting how people perceive what must be done and to remove the vestiges of discrimination. The worst remain regrettably in our head. And as Marcus Garvey said, and as Bob Marley popularized it, emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. The notion that we can continue to have people talking about a blacklist is wrong. The ability of our people to rise above the equation of everything negative with black is absolutely necessary if we are to start to look into the mirror and love ourselves and move to the next level. I want to support strongly the Commission's call for an encounter, not just with the UK, but with the European countries, the European Union. The European Union has, in its crafting of its unity as a regional movement, premised itself on a human rights convention that in no way accepts that anything that happened during the course of slavery and colonialism could be right. If it was not right, if it is not right now, under the European Convention of Human Rights, to which the United Kingdom and others belong for many decades, it cannot be right for them to have done it before the formation of the Union. It cannot be right for us to accept that persons should, with no remorse, keep the proceeds of illicit gains from a crime against humanity without seeking to create a development compact for the people of this region. The fact that others, such as universities and enterprises, benefited, they, we agree, must also be held to account for their actions today with respect to wanting to right size and put balance back on the table. No one is asking for anything other than fairness at this stage. No one is asking for anything other than fairness. The world in which we live has too many other battles for us to be fighting, for us to continue to have to fight this one. We in the Caribbean are at the front line of those battles against climate, those battles in this pandemic, those battles against violence, those battles against smallness and economic marginalization as a result of an inability for small people to be able to influence the policy framework of large regional communities or global communities. And therefore, I ask us to work together, to meet, to begin to see how we can make sure that this generation does not bequeath to the next the continued battle for reparations. We can define it. We can ensure that there is a framework of fairness for all, but above all else, we must remove the obstacle that has continued to confront too many of our people upon birth, that they are being born into countries that have been continuously marginalized, regrettably, by the larger powers of the world who ought to know better, because they were the ones who 75 years ago agreed that we should have a charter for a better global community. The problem is that that charter was premised on a number of countries that existed at the time that had not yet come to grips with the decolonization movement and the creation of the countries that were to become independent from India, going right back through to some of the very small nations within our Caribbean. We have now, therefore, to ensure that a framework for reparations not only deals with the economic development of our countries, but it also deals with the global legitimacy that is necessary for all peoples if we are to go forward with respect to a level playing field as former colonies who have been disadvantaged through lack of voice, lack of access to capital, and lack of fairness. I ask, therefore, my friends, that we in the region come together with calmness, but with a clarity of thought and with a strength of purpose that no one can continue to move us away from from the mission that is at hand. As I said, this is 20 years clear in December for me that I have been associated with this, and nothing happens by accident. I come here this morning, therefore, to support on behalf of our region a legitimate cause that must continue to be the mission of those within the public and private sector who recognize that we cannot get out of a 40-foot hole on our own, no matter how many decades have passed since the moment of the raising of the flag for independence. We need the assistance of the global community to right the injustices of the past and to give us the appropriate platform, not just money, but space, to be able to ensure that we too can deliver for our people, rather than simply believing that those who were responsible for the injustices must be the only ones to right the wrongs of the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. We move now to hear from Minister Grange, the Honourable Olivia. We call her Babsy Grange, MP, CD, has been the Member of Parliament for St. Catherine Central since 1997 and currently serves as Minister of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sport for Jamaica. Minister Grange has had a long career as a cultural activist, community activist and politician committed to the promotion of youth and women's affairs with a particular focus on job creation and improved health care. She's a firm believer in reparation for colonial wrongs and has portfolio responsibility for the National Council on Reparation, the council in Jamaica. She's a proud mother to one daughter and has 3 granddaughters, and she always wants us to say that. So, Minister Grange, it's my pleasure to ask you to make your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. Colleagues, good morning. In February 2007, a private member's motion moved by the Honourable Mike Henry, Member of Parliament, in the House of Representatives here, was unanimously passed to pursue reparatory justice from Britain for the people of Jamaica. This was a signal development, and mine was the privilege to appoint the first National Commission on Reparation in 2009, as it then was called, and chaired by the late Barry Shavans. For the first time, the government of Jamaica had officially declared its commitment to securing reparatory justice for Jamaicans, an entitlement born out of the reality that our ancestors were forcefully removed from their homeland, the continent of Africa, taken across the Atlantic Ocean to the Caribbean, where they were enslaved, and where for 400 years they toiled without ever reaping the rich rewards of their labor. Instead, it was the enslavers and colonizers and their successors up till today who have enjoyed the fruit of their labor. Our ancestors suffered the most degrading and inhumane treatment recorded in world history. The foundations upon which a global economic and socio-political system evolved, one that perpetually defames and disenfranchises people of African descent. We will relentlessly pursue justice and reparations in its varied forms. The issue of reparatory justice is not new to us as people of African descent. Our history records many so-called revolts, which we have renamed wars, because of the strategic and tactical elements involved in these events. Our ancestors and leaders over the past many decades have never relented in this call. From as early as 1865, there was a petition from working people in St. Anne, parish of St. Anne, to Queen Victoria, requesting assistance so that they could develop their ways of livelihood. She refused, and this became the critical factor that led to the Morant Bay War of the same year. Our ancestors knew that the British had raped and plundered them in unimaginable ways, and that to have declared that former enslaved persons were free was a farce. In the emancipation movement, there was nothing given to our African ancestors to even help them to make life, as we would say in Jamaica. Instead, the planters and enslavers were paid for the loss of our ancestors recorded as their property. The youngest leader of the Paul Bogle movement, James McLaren, argued that land should be given to black people for free because they earned it. He also argued that although he was born after slavery was abolished, he could not take care of his family, and therefore he was still in slavery. This is the essence of reparatory justice. It calls for a recognition that Britain actively participated in crimes against humanity through its systemized enslavement of Africans and concomitant depletion of the African continent of leaders, skilled persons, and children. The government of Jamaica, as part of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, continues to lobby for reparatory justice and will strengthen our collaboration with our Caribbean neighbors, who have now also established in their respective countries a National Council on Reparations. Jamaica's National Council on Reparation has the primary role of advising the government of Jamaica on the legal and political route to reparatory justice, consistent with the role of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, which has as its primary mandate to establish the moral, ethical, and legal case for the payment of reparations by the governments of all the former colonial powers and the relevant institutions of those countries, to the nations of people of the Caribbean community for the crimes against humanity of native genocide, the transatlantic slave trade, and a racialized system of chattel slavery. The National Council on Reparations, which we refer to as the NCR, situated in my ministry, the Ministry of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sport, carries responsibility for programs and actions related to the pursuits of reparations. The strategy of the NCR has traditionally included deliberations, sharing of perspectives, consultations, and national and international campaigns. Over the years, the NCR has engaged in various levels of consultations with the public, developed and disseminated documents relevant to the subject matter, and consulted with various reparations movements across the world, including through a recent visit to the United Kingdom. The NCR has also examined the legal, political, financial, and cultural elements of the reparations discourse, availing itself of opinions and actions pursued in other ethnicities and jurisdictions. In spite of all of this, however, there is a sense of inertia and indifference within the wider population regarding the reparations movement in Jamaica and the wider CARICOM. As such, there is perceived need for a jolt to action in an effort to mobilize public support and cause the assumption of greater postures of assertiveness which the movement requires for both success and greater public buy-in. Jamaica recognizes the strength of its people and Caribbean peoples in their own quest for self-definition and their indomitable spirit in rising to the state we are in today, despite persistent poverty. Caribbean governments have recognized their own responsibility towards their own peoples to render to them their just compensation for internal injustices meted out to them by the state and state agents. As such, the government of Jamaica has been keen to deal with injustices here in Jamaica. The Prime Minister of Jamaica, the Most Honorable Andrew Holness, recently expressed sensitivity to and concern for prevailing incidents of injustice locally. In this regard, in 2017, the government of Jamaica, by way of an apology by the Prime Minister, initiated the process of granting reparations to the Rastafari community for acts of aggression meted out against them on Good Friday, 1963, in the community of Coral Gardens, St. James. Through this agreement, the Rastafari community has received relief grants for those elders who survived Coral Gardens and are still alive today. The government has also established a Coral Gardens Trust Fund to support Rastafari development. Additionally, in response to the protests in America and around the world recently, Prime Minister Andrew Holness issued a statement in which he said that this has, and I quote, brought to the forefront the issue of racism and discrimination, which is very troubling to him as a black person, and to all when-thinking individuals and institutions that subscribe to the view that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. He also posited the need for us to look internally at our own systems to ensure that our people were not being similarly affected, citing the case of a man lost in the prison system for 50 years. The National Council on Reparations is about to continue its island-wide consultations towards the framing of a national policy on reparatory justice for Jamaicans. The result will be a robust policy of intergenerational scope to guide this and successive governments on the path to reparatory justice. This media engagement is not just timely, but necessary. And so we will continue to say, reparations now. My colleagues, one love, one heart, one destiny. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister Grange, the Minister with portfolio responsibility for reparation in Jamaica. So the floor is now open for questions. You have heard 3 great presentations. You can pose your questions on Facebook Live or on the chat on UWTV. We moderate both Facebook and the website for your questions. And a few of you have also used email to send in your questions. So as far as possible, indicate to whom your question should be directed. But nevertheless, if you don't, I will direct the questions. So the first question actually is from UWTV website. The question is for you, Vice Chancellor. How soon are you expecting to send off a formal request for a reparation summit, and how soon do you intend for it to be?
This is the second part of the attempt to create an environment for dialogue and diplomacy around this moment. 3 years ago, the CARICOM Commission, through the prime ministers of the region reached out to the governments of Europe in order to foster the creation of such a dialogue in a formal setting. The response from Europe was not positive in that first round, indicating that a development strategy, a reparations plan, was not the way they believe this history should be discussed, seeking a preference for various forms of aid and other kinds of official statements of regret. We have moved on from that moment, and we are now reaffirming from the Caribbean perspective the absolute importance of a formal dialogue to discuss all of these matters. CARICOM has created a 10-point plan, a 10-point reparations development plan, and these items ought to be subject to discussion and negotiation. We have heard Prime Minister Motley speaking about the issue of debt. When these Caribbean countries entered phase one of their independence in the 1950s and 60s, they called upon Britain and Europe for a development plan to assist the transition from colonization to nation building. These requests were rejected. The official position of Britain, for example, was that the Caribbean could receive aid for social welfare, but it would not receive any capital development plan of any significance. And therefore, their argument was that the Caribbean should borrow to finance at independence. It should borrow. The Caribbean government should borrow money to clean up the mess that they had inherited from Britain and from Europe. Well, this is exactly what has happened. And the Caribbean region has now become the most indebted part of the developing world, precisely because they were driven into this debt trap, that if they wanted to clean up the illiteracy, the ill health, the slum accommodation, the poor infrastructure, the terrible agricultural systems, if they wanted to develop the foundations for growth, they had to borrow. And that the wealth that was extracted from this region, a portion of it that was expected to be the region borrowed itself into great debt to clean up the mess that they had inherited. This is unfair, this is immoral, and this is legally unjust. And so the letters calling for a return to the table for negotiation will be imminent and will be done as soon as our political leaders are so ready to engage at that intergovernment level. So we are ready and keen to place on the agenda the 10-point development plan for reparations, one of which is calling for debt cancellation as part of a strategy. But there are many other items there that should be the subject of a formal summit of discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. There are other questions rolling in, but let me pause to welcome David Commission from Barbados. The Prime Minister had to leave. Minister Granger's had to go to Cabinet. So David Commission is standing by in Barbados to fit in for the Prime Minister. He is, of course, he's Barbados' representative to CARICOM. So quite fitting that he has joined us. Welcome, David. And so let me shoot you a question, from email. So some regional intellectuals are calling for a Marshall Plan for the Caribbean. How do you respond to that idea? David? No, he hasn't joined us yet? Okay, so, okay, yes, all right.
At the end of the Second World War, there was tremendous concern for the cost that Britain paid in defeating the Nazi threat to world civilization. And there was a concerted effort to rally around Britain to put it back on track in terms of its development. And that became the basis of a post-war transformation of the British economy. The Caribbean at the same time was in the same position. The Caribbean leaders after the war called upon Britain and Europe to extend a sense of a Marshall Plan for the Caribbean region. It too had paid a price in the Second World War, but it had a greater history of paying a price at the level of humanity. And so there has exploitation, the greatest crimes against humanity in modernity. And yet the Caribbean was left to flounder. Yet the power of Europe, the political and economic power, was used to push back the requests of the Caribbean people for assistance in transformation from colonization to nationhood. Those requests for a plan of support were systematically rejected, and in fact not only rejected but were considered to be absurd and irresponsible. And so the Caribbean countries took it upon themselves to take responsibility for their future, got on with it, but got on with it knowing how much better this region would have advanced if Europe, Britain especially, had honored its obligation to a Marshall Plan for this region. That call remains at the heart of the CARICOM 10-point reparations development plan.
So, VC, you have answered some questions also in your response a while ago, but here's another one from UWI Facebook, UWI TV's Facebook. Have we in mind an institutional arrangement to ensure that if and when we get the reparation, they are directed to areas that need it most?
The CARICOM Reparations Development Plan calls for the establishment of a regional reparations development fund that would be established in order to manage the process. Such an institution is consistent with international law. Whenever reparations is paid to alleviate the pain and sufferings of communities around the world, the legal provision always called for a committee of trustees to give oversight to the management of those resources and to make sure that those resources are allocated for the purposes prescribed. It is not an ad hoc and loosely arrangement. It is a highly structured and formal legal system whereby resources are managed by trustees chosen for their integrity to make sure that there is proper adjudication and allocation of those resources.
Thank you. There's another one. I'm told David is having some problems connecting with us, but we will. You're on now. Okay, perfect timing, David, because the question has been directed specifically to you. It is this, and this is from Facebook. How can the advocacy for reparations be broadened in all the islands and countries of the region to include the masses?
Thank you, Vereen. Pleasure to be here representing Ms. Motley.
And thank you for being here.
It has to be made a national enterprise. It has to, well, you know, in each territory, we have a national reparations committee or task force. Viewers should be aware that the structure that CARICOM has set up, institutional structure, comprises each member state at the governmental level setting up a national committee or task force on reparations, and the chairpersons of those national committees then form the membership of the CARICOM Reparations Commission that Sir Hilary leads, and that in turn takes policy guidance from the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations that Barbados chairs. So Prime Minister Motley would be the chair now. So that national public education and sensitization effort has to be the work principally of the National Committee or Task Force on Reparations. And they have to reach out to both the formal education system, the informal education system. They have to reach out to political parties, trade unions, civil society organizations, women's organizations, youth organizations. Our organizations have to be educated about the issue. They have to be encouraged to make reparations a part of their manifesto, a part of their organizational programs. But in addition to the work needs to be done locally in our Caribbean member states, we also need to enlist the services of our embassies, our high commissions, our diplomatic missions. That has to be a very important part. International diplomacy. We have to tell our story to the world. Just as the Jewish people have told the story of the Jewish Holocaust to the world, we too have to tell our story to the world. We have to develop our reparations campaign into an international cause célèbre with the same potency and power and comprehensiveness of the anti-apartheid movement of the 1970s and 1980s. So this is very critical because yes, we are going to have those conversations with the European and North American governments. We may even institute legal action, but it is so important that underpinning all of that is a mass movement. And it's a groundswell of popular opinion right across the globe supporting our effort for reparations.
Thank you very much. Let me pose another question, this time to the VC. Thank you for that reminder that you're acting as chairman of the Reparation Commission today. So why is the CARICOM Reparations Commission choosing this time to renew your call to the European states for reparations for African enslavement and indigenous genocide? Why this time?
Well, it is not so much a renewal of a call, but an evolution of it, because this is a call that is now some 80 years old. In fact, even longer. If we look at the history of the call for reparatory justice in the Caribbean context, from the 1830s, when the first generation of enslaved people were asking for the Emancipation Act to include reparations for them, and there were representations. The enslaved people about to be emancipated were saying that we should be subject to reparatory justice in the context of the Emancipation Act. And it's not the slave owners who should get the reparations. As it turned out, the slave owners received the reparations and the enslaved did not receive the reparations, though they had called for justice and for resources. They wanted to go into their freedom with resources based upon the extraction of wealth from their labor. They did not get that. From that moment to this moment, there have been at least 7 waves in the call for reparations. So this moment in time is the 7th iteration . All that is evolving systematically over time at each particular moment. And this is where we are at the moment. Another opportunity, another grand opportunity, where there is a global moral call for justice and the need for a dialogue and diplomacy to resolve this matter. As we have heard from Mr. Commissioner, His Excellency, representing the government of Barbados and CARICOM. The call is for dialogue. The background, of course, is that the discourse around litigation, International Court of Justice, and all of the other institutions that provide
the colonial powers needed to provide the new federation with the resources to put in place a development plan in light of the fact that they had plundered our territories for centuries. And similarly, even at the time of the collapse of the federation, when the effort was being made to construct the Federation of the Little Eight, one of the demands that was put on the table to the British Colonial Office was that Marshall Plan for the new Federation of the Little Eight, they were demanding resources. And one of the reasons that the Federation of the Little Eight never came to light and we went to independence singly was because the British Colonial Office refused or they kept on delaying the discussion about the reparation type resources needed to finance an economic and social development plan for what would have been the new federation. So yes, we have been very consistent, and I think that we have to keep on making the case that that entire European industrial civilization, that massively wealthy civilization that exists today, that it was built on the backs of our foreparents, these Caribbean colonies, these slave plantation colonies of the 17th and 18th century, and the system of transatlantic trade that the European powers developed with the Caribbean plantation colonies as the core, that triangular trade between Europe, the west coast of Africa, across to the Caribbean, then back to Europe. That whole industrial civilization was built on that system, whether it was their merchant fleet, their shipping, insurance, banking, the development of infrastructure, the harbors, the docks, the canals, the development of agro-industry, the cotton industry, you name it. The development of modern Europe is based on the plunder of our ancestors. And so that's what we are talking about. We are making a case for justice. For 300 and more years, you deprived our people of the fruits of their labor. Instead of the fruits of our labor going to develop our own families, our own institutions, our own societies and nations, they went to develop institutions, families, and nations in Europe. And we must insist on the magnitude. This is not something trivial. We are saying that at the very core of what you enjoy today, your standard of living, your industries, this whole industrial civilization that you have and that you are enjoying today, that we are the foundation of it, and what was taken to us, and the oppression that was visited upon us. That's the foundation of it. But we have to tell this story to the world. Some of our own people don't even understand this. And so a big part of this reparations campaign has to be to educate ourselves, but also to tell our story to the world. And so people can get a sense of the tremendous injustice that was done to us and of the unjust enrichment that other people have benefited from at our expense. This is why I keep on insisting. Yes, okay. I wasn't sure that you were back with me.
Yes, I apologize to our audience because we're having some internet instability, but there are no more. There's just one last question, and then I'll ask the chair of the CARICOM Reparation Commission to take that and also to give his closing statement. So the question is about repatriation. When the presentation or request for reparations are pushed, is there a request for a package for those who are desirous of repatriation, that move is totally funded by the reparation package? So, Chair, if you could answer that, and then you will make your closing statements, and then I will wrap up.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. The issue before us is not an historic or historical issue. It is about history in the present. It's about the fact that right now in this early 21st century, the legacies and the consequences of those historic actions are continuing to frame everyday life within the Caribbean. It is about today, the harm that is being experienced by persons just 2 generations away. There are many people in the Caribbean today whose great-grandparents were enslaved, and there are many people today in this region who grew up in households hearing about slavery from their great-grandparents. This is not a long time ago. We must remember that in many parts of the Caribbean, slavery was formally abolished at the end of the 19th century, so that in the 20th century, people who grew to maturity did so in the context of memory, of household and family memory. So we are talking about how to confront and deal with this continuing harm to the people of the region. This is not an abstract concept about what happened in the past, and those who have argued that it was a long time ago. It was not a long time ago. It is very present. It is very much today. And bear in mind, there are still colonies in the Caribbean. There are still citizens, persons in this region who are living under a colonial situation. So we are speaking about today and the harm of that reality in our present time. The question about repatriation is very significant, and this speaks indeed to the contemporary circumstance.
Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this program. Remember, you can watch this and all our programs on our website, www.uitv.org, available anytime, anywhere, and on any device. Also, join the conversation on social media by visiting our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages.